Welcome. This video is intended to help students understand what to expect on the Iowa Algebra Aptitude test. We believe that if we help you understand how the test will be held, what is on it, and a few of the basic ideas, it might help reduce your testing anxiety, which will allow you to rely on what you know rather than be nervous during the test. One of the most important things to remember about the IAAT is that it is a test given to determine whether a student is ready for Algebra 1. But it's also important to think of this not as whether or not it's a measure of how much math you know or how smart you are. It's just simply, do you understand some of the basic concepts that make you ready to take an algebra class? And while it is possible to try to take some of these quizzes over and over until perhaps you can pass based on the common questions that are asked, you do want to make sure that you do understand the concepts of pre-algebra, because again, you don't want to go into a math class where you're not ready. Especially in a class like algebra, it is very easy to get behind. So make sure that as you're preparing, you're not just trying to ace the test, but you're also making sure that you do really understand the material. And that is the goal of the test. It's going to ask you a long set of questions that probe into a lot of different areas about pre-algebra and algebra itself. One of the things about the administration of the IAAT is that it is a little bit different from some of the other tests that you've taken. This test is administered in 4 distinct sections. Each section will have 15 questions, and you will have 10 minutes to complete those 15 questions. Each test will begin with a sample, and then the teacher or the administrator will start the timer and you will begin the test. Now the 4 sections are pretty broad. The first is interpreting mathematical expressions. This particular section wants to know whether you can read tables and charts and graphs. It wants to know if you can get and interpret information from those charts and graphs. It's also going to ask you to translate concepts. When you read a word problem, what information do you get from it? Can you tell if you're supposed to add or subtract, if you're to multiply? Things like that. The next section of the test is going to look at the relationship between numbers. What we mean by this is things like formulas, patterns, or equations. For example, if you're given a series of numbers, do you recognize the pattern? For example, 1, 3, 5, 7 are odd numbers. They're also x plus 2, in which the next number grows by 2 in the series. So these questions are going to measure whether or not you can find those relationships and whether or not you might be able to recognize equations that would measure these relationships. The third section looks at the use of symbols. Symbols are very important to algebra. These are things like variables. Do you understand that n represents a number? Do you also understand what integers are? And of course, do you know the different order of operations for solving problems? The assumption is that you know, for example, that in upper level math, a multiplication sign is often not used because, of course, it's an x, and you don't want to confuse an x for an x. So there are going to be symbols thrown into the test to see whether you already know what those symbols mean. The final test is a pre-algebraic number skills and concepts test. And it's basically trying to figure out, do you understand the basic idea behind algebra, and can you solve problems with equations? These are generally not difficult problems. They're often very, I wouldn't say easy, but they're pretty straightforward. So if you understand the basics of combining like variables and understanding, the order of operations, generally you can do fine as long as you're reading carefully. Now again, this test is 4 sections. So once you complete all 15 questions, if you have time, you would be allowed to go and look back over those 15 questions. You would not be able to go back to any of the prior tests. Also, these 4 sections, they may or may not be offered in the order that we're presenting here. It depends on the test version and all of that. These are just the 4 types of tests. You might start with use of symbols and then move on to interpreting mathematical expressions. But again, 4 sections, 15 questions, 10 minutes per section, and you can only work on the section that you are assigned to at the time. Also, you would want to keep in mind things like don't write on the test itself, only bubble on the Scantron, and when you're given scratch paper, do your work only on the scratch paper. The test is scored by adding together the points that you received on each of the 4 test sections. So even though each section is going to be taken on its own, they are going to add up the points from all 4 sections to determine your score. In order to pass, the student must receive a 91% or higher. This is a higher pass rate than in previous years. It was 85% and it is now 91%. This means that you must get 55 of the questions correct out of 60. This does mean, however, that if you do poorly on one section of the test, but you ace the other 3 sections, you might still be fine. But again, your goal is to get a minimum of 55 questions correct to pass. So one of the common questions is, how do you prepare for a test like this? And honestly, having had a child and several of the child's friends go through this test, I can honestly say the earlier you begin to prepare, the better. If you try to crash course through pre-algebra and algebra a couple of weeks before the test, chances are you're not going to remember it, you're not going to be comfortable with it, and the stress level is going to be very high and make it difficult to do well on the test. But there are a couple of things that you can try, especially if you're starting to prepare for this earlier in the school year. First off, beginning with a video like this, understanding how the test is administered is a really big deal. Most students are not used to taking a test that works like this. 10 minutes is a very short amount of time for 15 math problems. The second goes along with that. Practice finishing 15 questions in 10 minutes. 10 minutes goes really quick when you're trying to work on math. And knowing what 10 minutes feels like is going to make the student a lot more comfortable. It's kind of heartbreaking to watch a child come out of a test and say, I didn't finish, because they were taking their time, they were checking each problem, and they only got through a couple of problems. In tests like this, it's generally best to remember to do a couple of basics, like making sure that you check your math, but perhaps don't start checking your math until you've done all 15 problems. If you can't remember how to do something, move on quickly. It's better to miss one question than to spend a lot of time and not complete 4 or 5 questions down the line that might have been easier. Now, along with this, you want to review basic concepts of pre-algebra. There's a lot of information out there, especially sites like Khan Academy, where they organize the material based on level. It's really good to go back and review. Now notice I'm saying review. Again, if you haven't learned a lot of this material, chances are trying to learn it at the last minute may not work well. But if you have, a couple of months, maybe you're going to take this in, March or April, and here we are, maybe you're studying this in December, I would suggest going and starting to look at the material, starting with ideas like order of operations and working your way forward into rational numbers and integers, positives and negatives, all of that. Look at graphing, look at charts, look at slopes. Make sure that you're comfortable with anything that is deemed pre-algebra, and then I would also suggest going a little bit into the material that is deemed algebra. Different school districts, different schools, different states have a different concept of what is algebra versus pre-algebra. So just because your teacher says, oh yes, slopes are second year algebra, well, guess what? The IAAT sometimes puts slopes on their tests because they feel that basic slopes are pre-algebra. So you want to go back and take a look at as much material as you can and review. Now, a fourth suggestion I have is to hone your reading skills. And this means to learn to practice close reading. Some of the questions that you're going to see on the test assume that you're reading carefully. For example, does a word problem talk about cookies or dozens of cookies? Are you working in ones or are you working in batches of 12? Things like that are an important part about algebra. You need to read closely. And so the test is going to have problems that are going to determine whether you read closely enough to do well in algebra. So get practiced in being able to read closely and look for those types of what I would say are slightly tricky questions, but honestly, they're an important part to understanding and solving real life problems. Finally, one of the best things you can do is take a couple of suggestions from the standard test prep material. One of the big ones is be ready to move on if you cannot answer a question. It is not uncommon to hit something that maybe A, you don't know, or B, you're so nervous that you don't recognize the problem. It's better to move on than to spend too much time working on a single problem and not do several problems later. You only have 45 seconds on average per question. So don't spend 2 minutes on problem 2 and then completely miss problems 11 through 15. If you can't do it, move on. Just be careful when you go to number on your Scantron. You don't want to miss number. That's a big mistake there. But don't get so far into your head that you lose your nerve. Oftentimes, students will say, oh, I can't do this. And then they move on and they start answering the rest of the questions. Well, once they're done, they come back and they go, oh yeah, okay, I can answer that. So don't let your nerves and don't let your frustration get you to the point where you don't finish the test. If you can't do it, move on. We hope that you found this information useful. Now, in order to help you apply this information, we have 2 different sources of tests that you can take. The first is free tests here on YouTube. We give you 1 sample test from each of the 4 types of tests. Each test lasts 10 minutes and gives you a sample and then gives you a scoring key at the end. Now, if you want to up your game a little bit, we also have paid tests on ProProfs. These tests cost a couple of dollars each, but they are a timed test with different questions. So you'll get 15 questions, 10 minutes, and at the end, you'll get your scored response. And at this time right now, we have 1 of each of the 4 types of quizzes. And the more people take the quizzes, and honestly, the more times people like us and subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, we'll be able to create more. Truly, our goal here is to try to help everybody do well on this test. We realize that some people can afford to pay hundreds of dollars to do test prep for a test like this. But we also want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to get the basics. While a $500 test prep course means that somebody's probably working closely with you, we do at least want to give you enough information that you can do the best you can and not walk into the test, honestly, caught off guard. So the more information you can get, the better. And we'd like to try to make this as cost effective for everyone as possible. So like us, subscribe, and if you got a couple of extra bucks, you can also take a second set of tests on ProProfs. Thank you very much, and good luck on your test.